Most people come back from camping with photos and bug bites. Some come back shaking, checking their locks twice, and never talking about what happened out there. 6 people shared their stories with me, and I promise you every single one of them changed how I think about the woods. Names have been changed, locations slightly altered, but the events? 100% real. So before we get into it, drop in the comments, where are you watching this from and what time is it right now? And if these stories hit you the way they hit me, subscribe to Bleak Fears. You're going to want to stay. We're opening on night 2, not night 1, because night 1 was fine. That's the thing nobody tells you about the ones that go wrong. They always start fine. I had been planning this trip for almost 4 months. For nights, solo, deep in the Ozarks National Forest. No trail markers after the first 6 miles, no other campers anywhere near me. That was the whole point. I work in a city, I live in a city, and every year I need at least 1 week where I can't hear a single human being unless I choose to. This was that week. I packed light, I knew the terrain well enough, and I went in with everything I needed and nothing I didn't. The first night passed without a single remarkable thing happening.
I åtte, I rid, I slept.
The forest did what forests do. It breathed and creaked and settled around me, and I felt nothing except grateful. Day 2 was the same. I hiked about 9 miles, found a creek I hadn't seen on the map, sat beside it for 2 hours doing nothing in particular. By the time I made it back to camp, the light was already going gold through the canopy. I cooked, I cleaned up properly. You learn to be meticulous about that in bear country. And I sat by the fire until it was dark enough that the fire was the only thing I could see clearly. That's when I noticed him. And I want to be careful here because I've told this story maybe a dozen times since it happened, and every time I tell it, I have to fight the urge to dramatize it. Because the truth is already dramatic enough without me doing anything to it. There was no sudden movement. There was no sound. I simply looked up from the fire toward the treeline, the way you do when you've been staring at flames long enough that your eyes want something else to focus on, and there was a figure standing there. He was at the very edge of the firelight, maybe 40 feet away, just standing, not moving, not speaking, not doing anything at all except existing in that space between the light and the dark, in a way that made absolutely certain I knew he was there. Now, before your mind goes somewhere cinematic, let me tell you what I told myself in that moment. I told myself it was another hiker, a solo traveler, maybe disoriented, maybe exhausted, maybe just stopping because he saw the fire and wasn't sure whether to approach. That is a completely reasonable thing to happen in a backcountry forest. People get turned around. People see a fire and feel the pull of it. I told myself all of that in about 4 seconds, and then I called out, "Hey, you need help out there?" You lost. Nothing. No response, no movement, no shift in posture. Just standing. I called out again. Same result. Here's the part 1 want you to sit with for a second, because this is where it stopped feeling like something with an explanation. He wasn't frozen the way a person freezes when they're surprised or startled. He was still the way a person is still when stillness is a choice. There is a difference, and your body knows it before your brain does. My body knew it immediately. My brain took a little longer to catch up. I did not sleep that night. I want to be honest about that. I got into my tent. I zipped it fully. I put my knife where I could reach it in under a second, and I lay there on my back with my eyes open listening to every single sound the forest made for the next 6 hours. At some point the sounds shifted the way they do around 4 in the morning. Something changes in the air, the insects recalibrate, the birds haven't started yet, and there's this window of almost total silence. And in that silence I heard nothing. No footsteps. No breathing outside the tent. Nothing that confirmed he was still out there. Nothing that confirmed he wasn't. When it was light enough to see clearly, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. The fire had died down to ash. The campsite looked exactly as I had left it, and the mud around the perimeter of my camp. And there was mud because it had rained softly the previous afternoon and the ground was still soft. The mud was marked with boot prints. I want you to understand the layout. My fire pit was roughly in the center of a small natural clearing. My tent was about 15 feet from the fire. The treeline circled the whole clearing at varying distances, maybe 30 feet out on one side, 60 on the other. The boot prints began at the treeline, and they circled the campsite, not a straight line of approach and retreat. Circles. Tight, deliberate, evenly spaced loops, like someone had walked the perimeter of my camp the way a person paces a room when they're thinking. I followed them slowly, trying to understand what I was looking at. They went all the way around. I counted what must have been 3 full rotations of the camp, and then they simply stopped. Not at the treeline, not at any logical exit point. They stopped in the middle of the clearing, roughly 8 feet from my tent door, as if the person making them had taken their last step and then ceased to exist. There were no prints leading away. I stood there for a long time. The rational part of my brain was working very hard. Ground becomes firmer, but not in a pattern like that. Animals don't wear boots. The prints couldn't have been mine. They were larger than my foot, and I hadn't walked that path. I had no explanation then. I don't have one now. I broke camp in under 20 minutes. That might be a personal record. I didn't eat breakfast. I didn't take my time. I just packed with my hands moving faster than my thoughts, and I started walking out. The trail back to the trailhead was roughly 11 miles. I did it in just under 3 hours. I'm not a slow hiker, but I'm not usually that fast either. I passed the ranger station at the trailhead. A small structure, one ranger on duty, the kind of station where someone sits behind a desk and hands out maps and looks like they've seen everything the forest has to offer and stopped being impressed by most of it. I went in. I wasn't planning to say anything. I think I just wanted to be around another person for 30 seconds. But he looked up at me and said, before I even opened my mouth, "You're out early." And something about the way he said it, not suspicious, not accusatory, just observational, made me say it. I told him what I'd seen. The figure at the treeline, the prints in the mud, the fact that they stopped in the middle of the clearing with no continuation. He listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, he didn't say, "You probably imagined it," or "could have been an animal." He didn't offer me an explanation at all. He just looked at me steadily for a moment and said, "You're smart for leaving when you did." That was it. Nothing else. I waited for more. Some context, some local knowledge, some story about the area that would make sense of what I was describing. And it didn't come. He just nodded once, like I had confirmed something he already understood, and looked back down at whatever was on his desk. I've thought about that ranger's response more than I've thought about the figure itself, because there are a few ways to interpret it. Maybe he was just being kind, just validating a spooked hiker without wanting to escalate the anxiety. Maybe he'd heard similar things before and had no concrete answers and had learned it was better to say less. Or maybe, and this is the one that still finds me at 2 in the morning sometimes, maybe he knew exactly what I was describing and knew that no explanation he could offer would make it better, so he offered the only thing he could. He told me I was smart for leaving. I've been back to the Ozarks since. Different area, different time of year, with 2 other people. It was fine. Beautiful, even. But I've never gone back to that specific stretch of backcountry, and I don't plan to. Not because I'm certain something dangerous was out there. I'm not certain of anything about that night, and I've made peace with that uncertainty. But because of those boot prints and the place where they stopped. Because of the way the ranger's face changed when I described them. Some things in the woods don't follow the rules of the world you drive home to. I don't know what to call that, and I've stopped trying to name it. I just know what I saw. I know what the ground showed me in the morning. And I know that whatever stood at the edge of my firelight that October night in Arkansas was close enough to watch me, patient enough to wait, and careful enough to leave no trail explaining where it went. That's the part one can't put down. The carefulness of it. Whatever it was, it didn't want to be followed. And it wasn't. She didn't call it a horror story when she first told me. She called it the worst 3 days of her life. There's a difference, she said. Horror implies something external, something coming at you from outside. What happened to her on that lake in northern Ontario was different. The thing that frightened her was sitting across the breakfast table from her, wearing her father's face. They had been doing this trip every summer since she was 11 years old. The same lake, the same rented cabin, the same 2 fishing rods her father had owned since before she was born. She was 26 that July, and her father was 61, and neither of them had ever once considered that a tradition that reliable could go wrong. It was 4 hours north of Toronto, deep enough into cottage country that cell service dropped out around the last gas station before the turnoff. That was fine. That had always been fine. They had never needed to call anyone from that lake. They had never had a reason to. The drive up was normal. Her father talked about work, she talked about her apartment, they stopped at the same diner they always stopped at, and he ordered the same thing he always ordered. She remembers that specifically, the familiarity of it, the comfort of a man who is so thoroughly himself that even his lunch order is a kind of reassurance. He was present. He was sharp. He made her laugh 3 times before they even reached the cabin. The first day was perfect. They fished until early afternoon, caught nothing worth keeping, ate dinner on the porch watching the light go off the water. Her father told a long story about a colleague of his that she had already heard twice but didn't interrupt because she liked the way he told it, the small adjustments he made each time to make it funnier. They went to bed early the way you always do the first night somewhere quiet, your body suddenly aware of how tired it actually is once the noise of ordinary life stops covering for it. The next morning is where she starts speaking more carefully when she tells it. He was already up when she woke, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was that he was sitting at the kitchen table doing nothing. Not reading, not making coffee, not looking out the window at the lake. Just sitting with his hands flat on the table in front of him, staring at a fixed point on the wall. She said, "Good morning." He turned and looked at her with an expression she didn't have a word for. Not blank exactly, but recalibrated somehow, like a familiar song played in the wrong key. He said good morning back. His voice was normal. She told herself she was still half asleep and reading too much into a man sitting quietly in a cabin at 7 in the morning. But here is where she stops in the telling and makes you wait a second, because she wants you to understand that she is not a dramatic person. She's an engineer. She thinks in systems and outputs, and she has very little patience for stories that exaggerate for effect. So when she tells you that something was wrong before breakfast was finished, she needs you to believe that she applied every filter she had before arriving at that conclusion. He forgot the word for the fishing rod. Not in a tip-of-the-tongue way. He reached for it. His hand extended toward where it was leaning against the wall and said, "Can you hand me the—" and then stopped. Just stopped. And looked at the rod like it was an object he was encountering for the first time and trying to classify. She handed it to him, and he took it, and the moment passed, and she filed it under bad night's sleep, and they went out on the water. On the water, he was quieter than usual. Not sad quiet, absent quiet. She asked him something about Thanksgiving, whether they were doing it at her aunt's house again, and he nodded, but a beat too late, and the nod felt like a response to a cue rather than an answer to a question. She watched him more carefully after that. The way his eyes tracked across the water was slightly different. Slower, like he was watching something she couldn't see. They came in at noon. He sat at the end of the dock for 45 minutes while she made lunch. She watched him through the window. He did not move. He did not check his watch, adjust his position, scratch his arm, look around. He sat the way something sits when it isn't thinking about sitting, total stillness without intention. She had to call his name 3 times to get him in for lunch, and when he came inside he looked at the sandwich she had made him and said, "Oh, you made food," like it was unexpected, like he hadn't eaten in this cabin with her every summer for 15 years. She asked him directly that afternoon if he felt okay. He said he felt fine, and then he smiled, and the smile was correct. It reached his eyes, it had the right shape, it was her father's smile, but it was a half-second delayed. Like a translation, like something that had learned the smile rather than owned it. That night she didn't sleep. She lay in the dark, and she did something she is not proud of. She says, but she needs to include it because it's the truest part. She lay there and she went through, methodically, every explanation she could construct. Stroke. She looked up the symptoms on her downloaded offline medical app. She'd had the foresight to save it, habit from remote travel, and check them against what she'd observed. Possible, but inconsistent. He had no facial drooping, no slurred speech, no weakness on one side. She looked up early-stage dementia. She looked up dissociative episodes. She looked up carbon monoxide poisoning and then got up and opened both windows in the cabin before she could stop herself. And somewhere between midnight and 3 in the morning, she looked up tick-borne encephalitis. And she read the early symptom profile. And she stopped breathing for a moment. behavioral changes, personality alteration, confusion presented as normalcy. Patients often appear functional to outside observers while being profoundly disoriented internally. She thought about the 45 minutes on the dock. She thought about the word he couldn't find. She thought about the smile that came a half-second late. The next morning he did not know her name. He did not say he didn't know it. He didn't announce the absence. He simply never used it, and when she said, "Dad, it's me," he looked at her with something that was almost recognition. The shape of it, the outline, but not the substance. He called her the girl twice in the same hour. Not cruelly, not in confusion exactly. The way you refer to someone you haven't been properly introduced to yet. She made a decision. She told him they were leaving, that she'd forgotten something important back home, kept her voice completely level, and he nodded and said that was fine. She packed both of them in under 30 minutes. She told him to sit in the passenger seat, and he did. She drove the 4 hours back to Toronto without the radio on, checking the mirror every few minutes, listening to him breathe. The emergency room doctors identified acute encephalitis within 2 hours. The infectious disease team confirmed it was tick-borne, most likely contracted on the first day when they walked through the tall grass along the south side of the property. He spent 11 days in the hospital. He recovered fully, or close enough to fully that the difference only shows up in small ways she doesn't describe to people she doesn't trust. He doesn't remember those 3 days. Not a single piece of them. She has never told him what it was like from her side. Not the dock. Not the smile. Not the moment he called her the girl. She decided he doesn't need to carry that, and she's made her peace with carrying it herself. But here is the thing she says at the end, the part that stays. During those 3 days, there were 2 moments where he became agitated. Not violent, she wants to be clear about that, but resistant. The first time was when she tried to use the satellite communicator she'd found in the emergency kit to reach out for help. He became immediately intensely uncomfortable, stood between her and the device. She backed off and waited, and eventually he settled, and she eventually found another way. The second time was when she moved toward the boat on the 3rd morning, before she'd made the decision to drive out. Thinking she might go for help by water, he stepped in front of her, put his hand on her arm, not gripping, just present. A barrier. She doesn't know what that means. She's thought about it from every angle her engineer's mind can approach it from. She says it's possible it meant nothing, that a man in a neurological crisis, stripped of language and context, was operating on some protective instinct, some fragment of himself that recognized she was trying to leave and didn't want to be alone. That's probably what it was. That's almost certainly what it was. But it was still her father's hand on her arm, in a cabin 4 hours from anyone, with no cell service and a boat she couldn't reach. She said the word horror doesn't fit it. But she also said she hasn't been back to that lake. She said she thinks about selling the rods. She said some places stop being places you return to once they show you what they're capable of holding. She told me this over coffee, completely dry-eyed, in the tone of a person who has processed something enormous and arrived somewhere that looks like calm but is really just the far side of something she'll never fully name. I didn't know what to say when she finished. I still don't. We didn't report it for almost 2 weeks. That's the part people find strange when I tell them, that 7 adults with phones and cars and perfectly functional relationships with law enforcement sat on this information for 14 days before anyone picked up the phone. But if you'd been there, if you'd seen what we saw and understood how little sense it made, I think you'd understand why. Because there's a specific kind of silence that falls over a group of people when something happens that none of them can explain. And in that silence, nobody wants to be the one who says it out loud first. There were 7 of us. We'd been doing this trip every Memorial Day weekend for 4 years running. Same group, rotating locations, always somewhere in the Boundary Waters. If you've never been to the Boundary Waters Canoe Area Wilderness in Minnesota, the scale of it is difficult to communicate. Over 1 million acres of connected lakes and rivers, most of it accessible only by paddle, most of it without any infrastructure at all. No roads in, no rangers patrolling overnight. Just water and forest and the kind of silence that feels earned because you had to work to get to it. We loved it. We'd chosen it specifically because it was difficult to reach and because once you were in, you were genuinely, completely in. We put in on Friday afternoon. For canoes, 3 days of food, tents and dry bags, and the particular organized chaos of 7 people who've done this enough times to have a system but still manage to forget at least one thing every year. That year it was a lighter. We had 4 backup lighters. Nobody worried. Friday night was the kind of night that reminds you why you do this. We camped on a small island, which is the move in the boundary waters if you can find one. Natural moat, no land access, wind keeps the bugs manageable. We cooked over the fire, somebody brought a flask of something good, and we sat out until almost midnight watching the sky in a way you simply cannot do anywhere near a city. Dylan was the last one still talking when most of us drifted toward the tents. That was normal. Dylan was always the last one talking. We need to stop here for a second, because what I'm about to describe is the part where every rational instinct you have is going to reach for an explanation, and I want you to know that we reached for every single one of them first. Every one. We are not people who jump to conclusions. Among the 7 of us, we have 2 nurses, an accountant, a high school teacher, and a structural engineer. We are, as a group, almost aggressively reasonable. I need you to hold on to that as I tell you what Saturday morning looked like. Dylan was gone. Not gone like he'd stepped away to use the bathroom. Gone like he had never been in the tent at all, except his sleeping bag was there, half unzipped, with the clear impression of a body in it. His boots were there. His dry bag with his wallet and his phone was there. His phone, which had been at 40% battery the night before, was completely dead, which we didn't think about until later. The canoes were all still pulled up on shore, accounted for. The island had one small beach on the east side and a rocky shelf on the west and about 40 feet of dense brush between the two. There was nowhere to go. There was no way off that island except by water, and all 4 canoes were there. He was not on the island. I don't know how to fully convey what the next 6 hours felt like. There's a specific texture to fear when it's mixed with total confusion. It doesn't feel like panic. It feels like the ground has stopped following the rules you've always depended on it to follow. We searched the island 3 times. We called his name across the water until our voices were raw and the sound just went out and disappeared into all that space. We paddled to the nearest neighboring islands. There were 2 within reasonable distance, and searched both. We debated whether to paddle out to the nearest entry point and get help, which would have taken the better part of a day, and while we debated it we kept searching because none of us could fully commit to the idea that he was simply not there, because that was not possible. He was not there. Around 2 in the afternoon, one of the nurses, the one with the most composure always, sat down on a rock on the shoreline and said very quietly, "We need to say the thing we're not saying." And we knew what she meant and nobody wanted to say it, and eventually somebody did. We said that if Dylan had gone into the water in the night, in the dark, in a lake that cold, the outcome was one thing and one thing only. And we were looking at each other across that island trying to figure out how to hold that when somebody's radio, we'd brought a small weather radio, old habit, picked up a signal from the ranger station. We made contact. We reported a missing person. We gave coordinates. And then we sat on that island for another 3 hours waiting because that is how remote we were, and the waiting was its own specific kind of terrible. The ranger canoe came from the south. There were 2 of them, and about 40 minutes after we'd made contact, before the rangers even reached us, one of our group who'd paddled out to guide them and came back with a look on his face that I cannot fully describe except to say it was the face of someone who had just been relieved of the worst weight of his life and didn't yet know how to stand up straight without it. Dylan was alive. He was 6 miles away, across 2 portages and at least 3 separate lakes. Sitting on a rock on the eastern shore of a lake we hadn't even planned to visit on this trip. Soaking wet from the waist down, wearing 1 boot, completely unable to explain how he had gotten there. He wasn't injured. He wasn't hypothermic, though they checked carefully. He was conscious and coherent and recognized the ranger immediately and answered questions correctly. He knew his name, he knew what year it was, he knew the names of everyone on the trip. What he did not know, what he genuinely, completely did not know, was anything that had happened between the moment he closed his eyes in the tent Friday night and the moment he found himself sitting on that rock Saturday morning. Nothing. Not a fragment. Not a flash. Total blackout covering what the rangers estimated, based on his location and the terrain, would have been at least 4 to 5 hours of movement through wilderness at night, across portages that require lifting a canoe, through water cold enough to be dangerous, wearing 1 boot. They took blood. This is the part one want you to pay attention to. They took blood at the ranger station on the way out, and a full panel was run, and the results came back with a benzodiazepine compound in his system. A sedative. Not one he had a prescription for. Not one any of us had brought. Not one he had taken voluntarily or had any awareness of taking. There is no clean ending here. That's what I need you to sit with. There is no conclusion, no person identified, no explanation for how it got into his system or who administered it or what happened to him in those 4 to 5 hours in the dark. The investigation, and there was one, briefly, produced nothing actionable. Nobody else had been reported in our area of the boundary waters that weekend. The ranger station had no record of other permits for those lakes. The question of how someone gets a sedative compound into a person sleeping in a tent on an island with no land access was one that the investigators acknowledged openly and then, as far as we could tell, quietly set aside. Dylan doesn't talk about it. That's his right, and we've never pushed. But there was one thing he said in the ranger station that afternoon, while we were all still in that stunned, deflated state that follows sustained terror. He said it almost offhandedly, like he wasn't sure if it was relevant. He said that he had one image, not a memory exactly, more like the residue of one. A light, a single point of light moving through trees at a distance. And a sound he couldn't identify, low and rhythmic, that he associated with the image but couldn't connect to anything in his waking experience. That was it. That was all he had. We drove home on Monday in near silence. Not the comfortable silence of people who've spent a good weekend together and run out of words. The other kind, where everyone is alone with the same question and nobody has the language to put it on the table. We'd gone in 7, come out 7, and it should have felt like relief, pure and simple. It didn't feel like relief, because one of us had been somewhere we couldn't account for, had been moved through a wilderness in the dark in a state he had no access to, had something in his blood that none of us put there. And whatever had happened on those lakes between 2 and 6 in the morning on a Saturday in late May, whatever decision had been made in that darkness about what to do with him, had ended with him alive on a rock in one boot. We've never gone back to the boundary waters. All 7 of us, independently, without discussing it as a group, have simply never proposed it again. The trip that defined our friend group for 4 years just quietly stopped happening, and nobody ever called a meeting about it or sent a message asking whether we should try again somewhere else. I think we all understood, without saying it, that we'd used up something on that trip. Some reserve of luck or safety, or whatever it is that keeps the worst version of a situation from becoming the actual version. We didn't want to find out if we had any left. It wasn't until he said the word, smart, that I understood we had never been safe. Everything before that moment had a possible explanation. Everything before that moment could be filed under coincidence, under misread signals, under 2 people being slightly too jumpy on their first real camping trip together. I had been filing things away all weekend, methodically, the way you do when you're trying to talk yourself out of something your body already knows. And then he said that one word, in that specific way, with that specific smile, and every file I'd created came open at once. We had arrived on a Thursday. Great Smoky Mountains National Park, mid-June, a developed campground, meaning there were designated sites, fire rings, a bathroom block about 200 yards down the path. Not wilderness camping, not remote, the kind of camping that eases you into it, where you're close enough to other people that it feels manageable, where the parking lot is visible from your tent if you angle yourself right. This was intentional. Neither of us had camped together before, and the plan was to start somewhere with some infrastructure, get comfortable, and work up to something more serious next time. The campsite next to ours was empty when we arrived. Clean fire ring, unmarked picnic table, nobody's gear anywhere. We were glad for it. A buffer, some extra space, nobody else's lantern keeping us up. We set up our tent, got the camp organized, cooked dinner, and by 9 o'clock we were sitting by the fire feeling very pleased with ourselves in the way that people who don't camp often feel pleased with themselves the moment they've successfully built a fire. We talked late. That's the thing I keep coming back to, and I'll explain why in a moment. We talked late, and we talked about everything, the way you do when you're away from your normal life, and the fire makes conversation feel more honest than it does under electric light. We talked about where we wanted to be in 5 years. We talked about a disagreement we'd been avoiding for weeks. We talked about our families. We talked about things you don't talk about in apartments or restaurants or anywhere with other people nearby. We were alone, and the campsite next to ours was empty, and the night felt private in the way that good nights away from home are supposed to feel. We went to sleep around midnight. Sometime after that, neither of us heard it happen, which in itself is something I've thought about. The site next to ours was occupied. When I unzipped the tent in the morning, there was a tent there. A small camping setup, one person's worth of gear, a single camp chair facing our direction. And in the chair, already awake, already watching, was a man. He looked to be in his mid-40s, unremarkable in every physical way. Medium height, plain clothes, the kind of face that your eyes move across without finding anywhere to land. He raised a hand when he saw me emerge from the tent. Friendly, easy. The gesture of someone who'd been sitting in that chair for a while and had been waiting for the moment to acknowledge me without making it strange. "Morning," he said. "Sleep well." I said yes. I asked if he'd come in late. He said he had. Said he tried to be quiet about it. Hoped he hadn't disturbed us. He hadn't, that was the thing. Setting up a tent at whatever hour he'd arrived. In the dark, close enough to our site that I could have reached out and touched his guy ropes. And we had heard nothing. We are not heavy sleepers, either of us. We had heard the family 3 sites down get up with their kids at 6:30. We had heard a car in the parking lot at some point in the early hours. We had heard nothing from directly next to us. I went back inside and told her. She said what I said, which was that it was fine. People arrive at campsites at odd hours. Sometimes they're very quiet about it. We got dressed and started making breakfast, and I told myself I was being paranoid, and I mostly believed it. He came over about 20 minutes later to ask if we had a spare lighter. We did. She handed it to him, and he thanked her and handed it back and said, genuinely pleasantly, "You two seem like you really needed this trip." She smiled and said yes. It had been a stressful few months. He nodded like he understood. He went back to his site. She looked at me. I looked at her. Neither of us said anything. Here is the moment I need you to actually stop and think about. We had not told him our names. We had not told him what we did, where we were from, how long we'd been together, or anything else about who we were. That conversation lasted approximately 90 seconds, and he volunteered nothing about himself and asked nothing about us beyond the lighter. And yet the thing he said, that we seemed like we really needed this trip, was not a generic pleasantry. The specific way he said it was the way someone says something when they know the shape of a thing. Like he'd been briefed. Like the observation wasn't an impression formed in 20 seconds, but a conclusion reached over a longer period. We talked about it quietly inside the tent while he was back at his site. We reconstructed it from different angles. Maybe it was just a nice thing to say. Maybe he was a perceptive person who could read something in our faces. Maybe we were tired and projecting. We kept coming back to those maybes, and by the time we'd finished breakfast, we'd mostly landed on coincidence and moved on. He knew her name by lunchtime. She hadn't introduced herself. I hadn't introduced her. He used it casually, in passing, as she walked past his site toward the bathroom block. Just inserted it into a sentence the way you use a name when you've known it for a while and have stopped thinking about how you know it. She came back to our site and told me, and the way she said it, steady, quiet, like she was reporting a fact she hadn't yet decided what to do with, made something shift behind my sternum. We started paying attention differently after that. Not visibly, we made a conscious decision to behave normally, to not signal that anything had changed. But we watched. We started cataloging. And what we cataloged over the next several hours was this. He was always nearby. Not in an aggressive way, not in a way that would look like anything to an outside observer. But wherever we were in the campground, the water station, the bathroom block, the small trail that looped behind the sites, he was there, or he arrived shortly after, or he was visible from wherever we stopped. Always at a reasonable distance. Always with a reason to be there that made individual sense. The accumulation of it was the thing. No single instance was alarming. The pattern was alarming. He referenced the disagreement we'd had by the fire the previous night. Not directly, not by name, but he made a comment. I don't remember the exact words. Something about how every relationship has its rough patches. That was so specifically timed, so precisely aimed at the conversation we had assumed was private, that I felt the blood leave my face. We had been talking quietly, not whispering, but quietly, in the way you talk at midnight when you think the world is asleep. He had been in the adjacent campsite, separated from us by maybe 30 feet of open space. He had been listening to everything. We made the decision that evening to leave in the morning rather than staying our planned second night. We made it quietly inside the tent, and we were careful. We didn't change our outward behavior. We sat by the fire for the normal amount of time, said goodnight at a normal hour, went into the tent and set an alarm for 6. We packed as fast as we could without looking like we were rushing. Everything into the car, methodical, efficient. He was awake. His camp chair was occupied. He had a cup of something in his hand, and we could feel his attention on us the way you feel sunlight on the back of your neck. We didn't acknowledge it. We didn't look over. We just moved steadily toward being gone. When the car was loaded, she went to take the last bag off the picnic table, and I went to make sure the fire ring was properly extinguished. Normal checkout procedure, the kind of thing that would look routine. And he stood up from his chair, walked over to the low rope boundary between our sites. Stopped there. "Safe drive," he said. And then, after a pause that lasted exactly long enough to make sure we'd feel it, "Smart. Leaving today." No context.
No explanation.
No smile that followed it or hand that waved it away into pleasantry. Just those 2 words, delivered in a tone that was almost gentle, and then he turned and went back to his chair and sat down with his cup and looked out at nothing in particular. We were on the highway inside 4 minutes. She cried for about 10 minutes and then stopped, and we didn't talk about it for the rest of the drive. There wasn't much to say that the silence wasn't already saying. I've tried, in the time since, to build an innocent version of that man. I've tried to construct a reading of the entire weekend in which everything he did has a clean explanation. The name overheard in passing, the comment about relationships just a generic observation, the lighter request just a lighter request, the smart at the end just 2 words from someone who noticed we were cutting our trip short and thought nothing of commenting on it. I've tried that version. I can't make it hold. Because there is one thing I always get stuck on, no matter how charitable I try to be. When we arrived, that campsite was empty, and the reservation system for that campground booked sites weeks in advance in June. A last-minute arrival in the middle of the night, in the site directly next to ours, in a campground that should have been fully booked. I've never looked into how he got that site. I've thought about looking into it many times. Something always stops me. I think, if I'm being honest with myself, I'm not sure I want the answer to make more sense than the question. Some things are more frightening once they're explained. Coda has never been wrong. That's the thing I need you to understand before anything else. In 6 years, across hundreds of miles of trail, through desert heat and mountain cold and every kind of terrain this state has to offer, that dog has never once reacted to something that wasn't there. Never. Not a false alarm, not a skittish moment, not a single instance of him losing his composure over something that turned out to be nothing. He is the most calibrated animal I have ever known, and I have known a lot of animals. So when I tell you what he did that night in Los Padres, I need you to already understand what it cost him to do it. Because Coda does not tremble. Coda has never trembled in his life. I had been planning a solo February trip into Los Padres National Forest for about 6 weeks. Off-season was the point. I've been hiking and camping alone for 11 years, and the one thing that genuinely improves a solo trip into the backcountry is the near-total absence of other people. February in Los Padres delivers that. The trails are quiet, the campgrounds are empty. The rangers at the trailhead look at you with a specific expression when you sign in that falls somewhere between respect and concern. I've seen that expression enough times that it stopped registering. I signed in, I noted my return date, and I went in. Coda went in with me. He always goes in with me. He is a Belgian Malinois, 6 years old, 72 pounds, with the kind of focus that makes people nervous when they first meet him and the kind of loyalty that makes them understand why shortly after. He has been camping since he was 8 weeks old. He knows the difference between a ground squirrel and something worth paying attention to, and he makes that distinction quietly, without drama. In 6 years he has alerted me to a rattlesnake I would have stepped on, a bear that was moving through camp, and once, in the Sierra Nevada 3 years ago, a man on a trail who was not behaving normally, who we gave a very wide berth to without incident. Each time, Coda's signal was clear and proportional and correct. Each time I listened, and each time listening was the right call. The first day in was everything I'd gone there for. 8 miles in moderate terrain, the kind of hiking that empties your head without emptying your legs. We made camp in the late afternoon at a flat, sheltered spot I'd used once before, set back from the trail by about a quarter mile and screened by enough brush that you wouldn't see it unless you knew to look. Good water source nearby, good sight lines in most directions. Coda 8 explored the perimeter in his methodical way, came back and lay down outside the tent door with his chin on his paws. Satisfied, I cooked, ate, spent an hour reading with the headlamp, and went to sleep around 9. Coda came inside, circled twice, settled at my feet. Normal. Everything completely normal. I woke at 11:43. I know the time because I looked at my watch immediately, the way I always do when something pulls me out of sleep, because knowing the time is the first piece of information, and information is what you run on when your heart is already going faster than it should. What had woken me was not a sound. It was the absence of Coda's weight at my feet. He was at the tent door, sitting upright, facing out, perfectly still. And he was trembling. Not shaking, trembling. The distinction matters. Shaking is big and visible and announces itself. Trembling is something different, something internal, the kind of movement that comes from a system running at maximum tension with nowhere to put it. I could see it in his shoulders in the dim light that came through the tent fabric. Fine, continuous trembling, like a wire under too much current. He was not growling. He was not barking. He was not making any sound at all. He was just sitting there, facing a specific direction in the darkness outside the tent, and he was shaking, and he would not look at me. That last part is what moved me from confused to deeply, seriously alert. Coda always looks at me when I address him. It is reflexive, it is immediate, it is one of the constants of our relationship. I said his name, quietly, once, and he did not turn his head. He did not flick an ear. He stayed fixed on whatever he was fixed on, and the trembling continued, and I understood in that moment that whatever was out there in the dark, in the specific direction he was facing, was occupying the entirety of his attention in a way that I had never seen anything occupy it before. I did not go outside. I want to be clear about that choice because I think some people, hearing this, would say that was the obvious move: go outside, headlamp on, see what's there, resolve it. And I've thought about whether I should have. I've thought about it many times. But here is the calculation I made in about 10 seconds lying in that tent. Coda, who is not afraid of anything, was afraid of something. And the information I would gain by opening the tent door was not worth more than whatever safety the tent represented. It was a psychological safety, not a physical one, I know that. Tent fabric stops nothing. But it kept me out of whatever sight line might have existed between me and whatever was out there, and in that moment that felt like the correct priority. So I lay there, knife in my right hand, a good fixed blade I've carried for 8 years, headlamp in my left, ready but not activated. And I watched Coda because Coda was my instrument. Whatever information existed about what was outside that tent was going to come through him. He sat at that door for 4 hours. I know that sounds like something I might be misremembering, rounding up for effect. I'm not. I checked my watch at 11:43 when I woke up. I checked it again at 1, at 2, at 3, at 3:40. At each interval Coda was in the same position, facing the same direction, trembling with the same fine continuous tension. At no point did he look at me. At no point did he make a sound. He just held his vigil in the dark, fixed on something I could not see and could not hear, and I held mine beside him. At some point around 4 in the morning, the tenor of the forest changed. It's a real thing, not a poetic one. There's a shift that happens in the deep hours, a recalibration of whatever ecosystem of sound had been running through the night, and it's subtle enough that most people sleep through it, but distinct enough that you notice it if you're awake and paying attention. Coda noticed it. His shoulders dropped by a fraction. The trembling slowed. Not immediately, not all at once, but over the course of maybe 15 minutes it wound down the way a motor winds down when the power is cut. Gradually, with a few last surges, then still. By 4:30 he had lain down. Not at the door this time. At my side, pressed against me with more contact than he usually seeks, which for Coda is itself a form of communication. I put my hand on his back. His breathing was steady. Whatever had held his attention for 4 hours had, by his assessment, gone. I did not sleep again. When it was fully light, real light, Not the gray suggestion of it, but actual morning. I unzipped the tent. Koda walked out ahead of me, which he always does, and did his usual perimeter check of the campsite. Ears up, alert, but functioning. Normal Koda. Whatever switch had been thrown the night before had been switched back, and he moved through the camp like himself, sniffed his bowl, looked at me with that particular expression that means he is ready for breakfast. I gave him breakfast. I ate something myself, barely tasting it, and then I made the decision to follow the direction he had been facing. It was a quarter mile, roughly. I paced it out, through a section of mixed chaparral and oak, down a slight grade, into a small clearing that sat in a natural bowl in the terrain. Sheltered on three sides, shielded from wind, invisible from any trail. Someone had been there. Recently. The evidence was not subtle once you were looking at it. A fire pit with ash that still held faint heat when I held my hand 2 inches above it. A tarp rigged between 2 oak trunks at sleeping height, the kind of setup you make when you know what you're doing outdoors. And around the perimeter of the clearing, a collection of food waste. Wrappers, an empty can, the remnants of 2 or 3 days of eating, arranged with enough familiarity that the space had the feel of somewhere someone had been living rather than just passing through. No gear. No person. The tarp was still rigged, which meant leaving had been a choice made without taking everything, which meant leaving had been done with some urgency, or with the intention of returning, or both. I stood in that clearing for a long time. I turned around and looked back in the direction of my camp. From where I was standing, in daylight, through the brush, I could see the bright fabric of my tent. Clearly, without effort. From there, at night, with a light source or without one, a person would have had a direct and unobstructed view of my camp for as long as they chose to stand there. I hiked out that same morning. 8 miles with a full pack, Koda ahead of me on the trail, both of us moving at a pace that had nothing to do with enjoying the scenery. I reported what I'd found at the trailhead, the clearing, the camp, the proximity. The ranger took notes. He said they'd look into it. He said these things happen, that people set up illegal camps in the backcountry, that it was probably nothing to worry about. He may have been right. I've allowed for that every time I've revisited it. It may have been someone simply camping illegally. Someone who heard me set up the night before and made the decision to move on before dawn to avoid interaction or citation. That is a reasonable explanation. That explanation is available to me any time I want it. But here is the thing about that explanation. It requires me to believe that a person camped a quarter mile from me, in a hidden clearing with a direct sight line to my tent, heard me arrive, watched my camp for some portion of the night, and then packed selectively and left in the darkness. And that Koda, who has never been wrong, who has never trembled before or since, held his position at that tent door for 4 hours over someone who was simply camping illegally and meant nothing by it. I've tried to believe that. I've given it every opportunity. Koda won't let me. Not because he tells me anything, he's a dog, and that night is behind him in the way that all nights are behind dogs, clean and uncarried. But because I know what he is. I know what it takes to make him tremble. And whatever was standing in that clearing in the dark, watching the bright fabric of my tent from a quarter mile away while he held his vigil at the door. Whatever was deciding, out there in the Los Padres dark, what to do, it was not nothing. The light above the cabin door had been working for 8 years. I know that because it was the first thing we checked every time we pulled up after dark. That single motion sensor light mounted above the door frame, the one that clicked on when you crossed the gravel in front of it and meant you could get the key in the lock without fumbling around with a flashlight. 8 years, for trips a year, never failed once. It was the kind of small, reliable thing you stop noticing because it has never given you a reason to notice it. Someone had noticed it. We had been coming to this hunting lease in East Texas every November since the 4 of us were young enough that the drive felt like an adventure rather than just a drive. Deer camp, technically. A private lease, several hundred acres of mixed pine and hardwood. A single plywood cabin that one of our fathers had built in the 90s and which we had inherited along with the lease when he passed. It was not a comfortable cabin. It was a functional one. 2 sets of bunk beds, a propane stove, a small generator we ran for 2 hours each evening and then shut off. No internet, no cell service beyond the occasional single bar that appeared and disappeared without logic. No neighbors for miles in any direction. That was the point. That had always been the point. For men, For days, the particular silence of a hardwood forest in late November, and the chance to be completely unreachable by anything that wasn't standing in the woods in front of you. This was the 10th year. We had a system so established it ran itself, who brought what food, who drove which truck, who took which bunk, who got the coffee going at 4:30 in the morning before the first sit. We were not people who needed to discuss the routine. We just fell into it the way you fall into something that has happened enough times to have grooves worn into it. The first 2 days were the first 2 days. Cold, quiet, the specific satisfaction of sitting in a deer stand before sunrise watching the world assemble itself out of darkness. Nobody tagged anything significant. Nobody cared. The hunting was always secondary to the being there, though we would never have said that out loud to each other, because saying it out loud would have made us the kind of people who talked about their feelings on a deer lease, and we were not those people. On the third afternoon, 2 of us went to pull the SD card from a game camera we'd hung on a primary scrape line about a mile into the property. Standard practice, you check the card, see what's been moving through, adjust your plan for the last morning accordingly. It was nearly dark by the time we got to it, and we pulled the card and walked back and sat at the table inside the cabin after dinner and put it into the reader and started scrolling through the images the way you always do. Fast at first, slowing down when something catches your eye. There were deer. Good deer, actually. A shooter buck appearing twice in the same 48-hour window, which was more than we'd had all season. We lingered on those frames, talked through the approach for the morning, felt the particular small excitement of a plan coming together. And then one of us kept scrolling, past the deer frames, into the earlier captures from earlier in the week. And he stopped scrolling. He didn't say anything for a moment. He just looked at the screen. And then he turned the camera toward the other one of us. And neither of them said anything for another moment. And then he got up and went to the door of the back room where the other 2 of us were already in our bunks and said very quietly, "You need to come look at this." The timestamp on the image read 3:12 a.m. This is important because game cameras in a hunting lease are motion triggered. They capture what moves through them when it moves. At 3:12 a.m. on a Tuesday in late November, on a private hunting lease with locked gate access on a road that saw maybe 4 vehicles a week, something had moved through the frame of that camera. It was bipedal. I want to be precise about this because I know how it sounds and I know what your mind reaches for when someone describes a shape on a game camera at 3 in the morning. I am not describing something ambiguous. I am not describing a shadow or a trick of the infrared or a deer on its hind legs or any of the other rational explanations we cycled through in the first 5 minutes of looking at it. It was a person, walking slowly, deliberately through the shooting lane we had cleared in front of that camera. Head down, moving in the direction of the cabin. There were 4 images. For separate triggers, meaning whatever it was had moved through the camera's detection zone slowly enough, or had paused within it to generate 4 distinct captures. In the last image, it was partially out of frame, moving toward the edge, heading in the direction of the cabin a mile away. The timestamp on that last image was 3:17 a.m. 5 minutes. It had been in front of that camera for 5 minutes. We sat with that for a while without talking. Then somebody said what all of us were already doing in our heads, which was working out the geometry. A mile from the camera to the cabin. Walking pace, through timber, in the dark. 20 minutes, maybe 25. Which meant that at roughly 3:35 to 3:40 in the morning 2 nights ago, whatever had walked past that camera had been at or near the cabin. 2 nights ago we had all been asleep. The generator had been off since 9. The cabin had been dark and quiet and none of us had heard a single thing. The decision to leave that night rather than in the morning was not dramatic. Nobody made a speech about it. One of us said, "I think we should go tonight," and the other 3 nodded and we started packing. That is the truest thing I can tell you about that moment. How quickly and quietly 4 men who had been coming to the same place for 10 years agreed, without argument or deliberation, to leave in the dark. The instinct was unanimous and it arrived fast, which tells you something about what we all understood when we looked at those images, even if none of us put it in words. We moved efficiently. Gear into bags, food into coolers, rifles unloaded and cased. The generator stayed off, we used headlamps, kept the light low, kept our voices lower. The unspoken agreement was to do this quietly and to do it fast and to not think too hard about why we were being quiet, because thinking too hard about why would require thinking about what might be within earshot. It was somewhere in that packing, Maybe 20 minutes in, maybe a little less, that one of us went outside to start loading the bed of the truck and stopped. Just stopped, standing on the gravel in front of the cabin door, headlamp pointed up at the door frame. He stood there long enough that the one closest to the door noticed through the window and went outside to see what he was looking at. The motion sensor light above the door had not come on. He had walked directly through its detection zone. The same path we had walked hundreds of times, the same gravel, the same distance, the path that had triggered that light without fail for 8 years, and it had not come on. He stepped back, stepped forward, waved his hand in front of the sensor. Nothing. He reached up and touched the casing and understood immediately what had happened, because the casing moved in a way it shouldn't, with a looseness that told you the internal contact had been broken. He unscrewed it the rest of the way, held it in his palm and looked at it in the beam of his headlamp. The bulb was intact. The wiring was intact. The sensor itself appeared undamaged. What had been done, and something had been done, this was not wear, this was not age, this was not the casing working itself loose over years of weather. What had been done was surgical. The light had been unscrewed just enough. Not removed, not broken, just turned carefully, by the precise amount required to break the contact without leaving any obvious evidence of interference. From the outside, we loaded the truck in about 4 minutes after that. I don't remember much about the drive out except that nobody spoke for a long time and that the gate at the road, which we had locked behind us when we came in, was locked when we reached it, which meant either we were wrong about everything, some combination of camera artifact and coincidence and a light that failed on its own, or whatever had been on that property had come in another way and knew better than to touch the gate. We reported it the next day, filed a report, provided the SD card images, explained the lease, explained the light. The deputy who took the report was professional and thorough and gave nothing away in his expression. He said they'd look into it. We never heard back with anything conclusive. The lease came up for renewal in February. We didn't renew it. None of us said explicitly that the reason was the camera footage and the light and the geometry of what those two things meant together. We said the cost had gone up, which was true. We said we were getting older, which was also true. We talked around it with the particular fluency of 4 men who have known each other long enough to have a shared language for the things they'd rather not name directly. But I'll name it here, because you came here for the truth of it and you deserve the truth of it. We didn't renew the lease because of what the light told us. Not the camera footage, as unsettling as that was. Footage can be argued with, explained, reframed. The light could not be reframed. The light was a fact with only one available interpretation. Someone had been to that cabin before we arrived, had walked that gravel, had stood at that door, had reached up in the daylight or the dark and turned that casing with careful, patient, deliberate hands, had done it precisely enough that it still looked intact, had done it quietly enough that 8 years of habit made us flip a switch on day 1 and see nothing wrong and think nothing of it. And then, 2 nights before we found the footage, had come back through the woods at 3 in the morning to see if the dark had held. It had. We'd given it to them without knowing. For men asleep in an unlocked cabin, because who locks a cabin on a private lease in the middle of nowhere, under a light that looked like it worked and didn't? I lock every door now. Every one, every time, without exception. My wife asks me sometimes why I'm so particular about it, and I tell her it's just a habit I picked up. That's not the whole truth. The whole truth is that I learned, on a November night in East Texas, that the thing standing between you and whatever's outside isn't always as solid as you've been assuming. Sometimes someone has already been there, already made their quiet adjustment, already decided what the dark should look like when they come back. And you never knew. You walked past it every day and you never knew. That's 6 stories from 6 people who went into the woods looking for quiet and found something else entirely. Every name changed, every location slightly shifted, but not a single detail of what happened altered. These are real. That's what stays with me most. Not that these things exist out there, but that the people they happen to are still out here too, living regular lives, checking their locks, never quite saying the full thing out loud to anyone except sometimes, in the right setting, to someone willing to listen. I'm glad they found me. If these hit you the way they hit me, you're already where you need to be. This is Bleak Fears. Stay close.